thank you everyone so much for watching. I'm with Dr. Robert Larmer, a philosophy professor at the University of New Brunswick, Canada. And today we're going to be talking about some common objections to miracle claims. Dr. Larmer has written the book, The Legitimacy of Miracle, which is an academic treatment. And then he's also written Dialogues on Miracle, which is more of a popular level book that reads like a Socratic dialogue with some philosophy students and their professor. I will definitely include links to those books in the description down below. And so thanks so much for joining us, Dr. Larmer.
You're welcome.
Can you tell me a little bit about your academic background for those watching and what got you interested in the whole topic of miracles?
Yeah. Well, I did my undergraduate work at Carleton University in Ottawa, and then I moved across the city and did my master's and doctorate at the University of Ottawa. In my late teens and early 20s, I went through a period of quite severe depression, and it caused me to kind of question what it all means. And I'd always loved the fantasy novels of writers such as Tolkien and Lewis, but I'd been influenced by a teacher to think in terms of materialist reductionism. And it seemed to me that miracles, if they occurred, were things that would puncture that materialism. And that led me into philosophy, and in particular into philosophical and historical investigation of miracles, and also looking at the credentials of theism. And I found that over a period of time that I was persuaded.
Awesome. And so were you a Christian like before, and then you had some doubts because of this, or these overcame your doubts, or did you spend any time, would you have classified yourself as an atheist for a period of time?
Well, early on, when I was young, my family went to church, but we had quit doing that. And as I say, under the influence of certain teachers, I was really into thinking of religion as, you know, a projection, as a crutch, all those kinds of typical objections. I don't know that I would have said I was an atheist, but I was certainly not, probably believed in God in a vague way.
Okay, I gotcha.
Yeah.
And so I can definitely relate to that. There was a period in my time, I considered myself an atheist for a little while, and then I guess something like maybe a generic theist or deist, and I just would read the gospel accounts, and I thought, Jesus is an interesting teacher, but these miracle reports are these like parables or kind of in a different way, or they just came across as like so weird and so foreign to me. And so I can definitely relate to that there. And so, well, let's jump into it a little bit, because you interact a lot with like the philosopher David Hume. And if you're going to interact with the argument for miracles, you're going to be interacting with Hume, because he supposedly has this reputation of just putting to death the whole argument for miracles, which I think is vastly overstated. I'm sure you'd probably agree. But Hume defined miracles as a violation of the laws of nature. Do you think that's a good definition? And if not, like, how do you think we would best define a miracle?
Yeah. What's interesting, you would mention that. Actually, the book I'm working on right now is a treatment of Hume's essay, going from early on. Before it, there was a large discussion of miracle, and then Hume's early critics. Hume said he gave an everlasting check, and I'm kind of thinking of titling this book Hume's Counterfeit Check, but we'll see. No, I don't think that defining miracles as a violation of the laws of nature is a good definition at all. I think one of the key concepts of a miracle is that it's a supernatural overriding of nature. So it's a divine intervention into nature. Now, Hume seems to think that that can only occur by violating a law of nature. but that is not the case at all. Miracles, in the sense of God overriding nature, can occur without breaking any laws of nature. So I thought, if you don't mind, I'll read a quotation from C.S. Lewis that I think is helpful.
Yeah, definitely. Sounds great.
It is inaccurate to define a miracle as something that breaks the laws of nature. It doesn't. If God annihilates or creates or deflects a unit of matter, he has created a new situation at that point. Immediately, all nature domiciles this new situation, makes it at home in a realm, adapts all other events to it. It finds itself conforming to all the laws. If God creates a miraculous spermatozoon in the body of a virgin, it does not proceed to break any laws. The laws at once take over. Nature is ready. Pregnancy follows according to all the normal laws, and 9 months later, a child is born. Just skipping over a bit. The moment a miracle enters nature's realm, it obeys all her laws. Miraculous wine will intoxicate. Miraculous conception will lead to pregnancy. Inspired books will suffer all the ordinary processes of textual corruption. Miraculous bread will be digested. The divine art of miracle is not an art of suspending the pattern to which events conform, but of feeding new events into that pattern. So if you think about it, the laws of nature by themselves don't tell us anything about what's going to happen. If you were to take Newton's laws of motion, say, an object in motion will tend to continue in motion. That doesn't tell you anything about what's happening on the parking lot. If you want to know what's happening on the parking lot, you have to have those laws applied to a set of initial conditions. So if you were to think, say, that you were going to make a billiards shot, Eric, and let's say you're a very good billiards player, you can line it up and you can predict exactly what's going to happen. But let's suppose that just as you hit that ball, I roll another ball onto the table. That will change what's going to happen. But at no point will Newton's laws of motion be violated.
Right.
All that happens is that you have an extra causal factor. So if God acts as a cause within nature, God doesn't have to break any of the laws of nature. He simply introduces more of the stuff of nature into the equation. Perhaps another way of thinking about it, I don't violate a law of nature if I cause a stone. I don't violate the law of gravity if I cause a stone to move away from the Earth's surface.
Right.
Well, if I don't violate a law by moving a stone away from the Earth's surface, why would we say that God does?
Right, exactly. And so it seems like he's just kind of loading the whole situation in his favor by defining a miracle in such a way. And so, and I like that quote because so many people, you hear that often, or at least I have from skeptics, that like, well, why didn't God just preserve the Bible perfect without any kind of chance for textual corruption? And so that has interesting applications to, you know, the whole Bart Ehrman-like objections to, well, you know, why did John chapter 8, the first few verses get added in there? Why didn't God just miraculously just keep everything perfect? And it just seems kind of unrealistic. And so, yeah, that's definitely very interesting there. Now, there is a popular slogan among skeptics, extraordinary claims, they require extraordinary evidence. And I'm sure you've probably come across this a few times.
Yes.
And it seems like when I'm talking with skeptics, they never really define exactly what they mean by extraordinary. But I usually find that it's often something that is well beyond what normal human testimony could ever hope to establish. And so, do miracle claims really need extraordinary evidence in order for us to rationally accept them?
I would say no. What they need is reasonable evidence. It may be that we want to say they require strong evidence, but extraordinary, I don't particularly think so. And well, I do treat this at more length in Legitimacy of Miracle book, but in claiming that miracles require extraordinary evidence, I think the materialist is in danger of begging the question, that is to say, assuming what needs to be proved. Thomas Aquinas said that there are two basic reasons for people not believing in God. The first reason is that we don't need God to explain things. The second reason is the problem of evil. Now, very few atheists would say we can logically prove that God doesn't exist. That's a very tall order. What they would say is that on the basis of Occam's razor, don't multiply entities needlessly, there's no need to invoke God to explain things.
Right.
Now, the problem with saying that miracles require extraordinary evidence is that if you're saying, well, the reason I don't believe in God is there's no evidence for God, and then somebody says, well, here's a claim of an event that would plausibly be described as a miracle, and you say, well, you know, we've already shown that God doesn't exist, so we shouldn't believe in miracles. Right. That's like saying, well, somebody says to me, there are no rabbits in the woods. And I say, why do you say that? And they say, well, there's no evidence for rabbits. And I say, well, look, here's some rabbit droppings. And they say, well, no, you can't have observed any rabbit droppings in the woods. And I say, why? And they say, because we've already shown that there's no rabbits in the woods.
Right.
But their only evidence for saying there are no rabbits in the woods is that there was no evidence for rabbits. But wouldn't rabbit droppings be evidence for rabbits?
Right. I would certainly think so.
So to say, well, we already know there can't be miracles because we know God doesn't exist. Well, miracles are events which, if they happen, would point to God. So to say that we don't need to take those reports seriously really begs the question.
Yeah, and I have seen a lot of skeptics do this. They'll say, well, in order for me to accept any sort of miracle claim, you're going to have to prove that the supernatural exists first, or that God exists first. And it's kind of like, I've always seen that as kind of getting the cart in front of the horse. It's like, well, if something like a miracle happened, say like the resurrection of Jesus, well, something like that happening on atheism, the probability of that is next to zero. While if something like theism is true, like probability of that would be very high. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. I think here we need to distinguish two questions. One question is, did the event occur? The next question, or the second question, is how should it be explained? And the criteria there are very different. An interesting comparison here is at one point, the very famous scientist, astronomer Laplace, he refused to believe in meteorites because he said, well, it's only ignorant peasants that are reporting this.
Right.
Well, peasants have as good an eyesight as anybody else. There is a question. The question is, did the event occur? And then we ask, what's its proper explanation? Now, if we, on the other hand, say, well, we don't have an explanation, so the event couldn't have occurred, that's very poor thinking.
Right.
So Laplace couldn't explain why stones would fall out of the sky, and he said, therefore, we can't trust reports that this event occurred. Well, I find some atheists, if they think they have a natural explanation of the event, will accept testimony to its occurrence. But if they think they can't explain it, they're inclined to say, well, it couldn't have occurred. But that's to confuse the two questions.
Right. Yeah, and it's kind of ironic that somebody like Laplace, who would pride himself on, being a scientific mind, and a lot of these new atheist types are the same way, and yet that was just fighting science with that type of mindset. And so, which is kind of ironic in a way.
Yeah. I don't want to take us too far away from our discussion, but one issue that connects here is some people are wanting to define science as having to accept what's called methodological naturalism.
Mm.
That is to say that if you're a scientist, you could never accept a non-natural explanation. The problem here, of course, is if you say, well, we always must explain whatever happens in the world in terms of natural causes, then supposing you have an event that's supernaturally caused, you've embraced a method that prevents you ever recognizing that event as supernaturally caused. Mm-hmm. So again, this issue of begging the question arises.
Yeah, if you're wrong, how would you ever know?
Well, yeah, and if you want to say, well, science is the search for natural causes, fair enough, but the search for natural causes doesn't guarantee that you're always going to find one. And in fact, science, in Big Bang cosmology, our best science says, well, we have an event, the very beginning of the universe, that doesn't have a natural cause.
Right.
So, yeah. You don't want to accept methodological naturalism as a condition of thinking scientifically.
Okay. So you quoted Aquinas, who is way ahead of his time if you think about it. I mean, what he said is the best arguments for atheism sounds very similar to the same thing you'd hear from very sophisticated atheist philosophers like maybe Graham Oppy. Naturalism just explains everything as much or perhaps better. And there's definitely the problem of evil, and that's kind of where a lot of these guys will go. And so some of these more sophisticated type of atheists will say that, okay, extraordinary claims probably still require some sort of extraordinary evidence, but in the sense that they just give a low credence to theism. So there's really no point in them really kind of rolling up their sleeves and digging to the evidence. And so I guess what I'm trying to say in a shorter way is, why should somebody who is an atheist begin to consider a miracle claim if they think at least that maybe they can't prove God doesn't exist, but they think the probability that God exists is very, very low?
Yeah, well, Hume attempts to deal with this. He doesn't consider that question explicitly, but he considers it in the sense, he says, well, the only time we get miracle reports are from barbarous and ignorant people who have received them, from the past. The only people that report miracles are crazies, so that, we don't have any good testimonial evidence for a miracle. Well, you mentioned you were going to have Craig Keener on at some point.
Yeah, I just had him actually a week ago.
Yeah. I highly recommend his 2-volume work on miracles. Mm-hmm. But he mentions in that book that at a conservative estimate, there are over 300 million people in the world who claim either to have experienced or observed firsthand what they take to be a miracle. Now, the point is that there are an awful lot of highly educated people, very sensible people that report miracles to us. So you don't, Hume is simply wrong to say that all reports of miracles come from the far past, from the distant past. There are all sorts of reports today. I think later on, you asked that I would, if I had any accounts, I would give them to you, that I would mention them. I'd be happy to mention a couple. But there are highly credible reports of miracles. Mm. And the atheist who says, well, there aren't, is simply mistaken.
Yeah. Well, we could jump to that question right now, if you want to. And sure. So if there are credible miracle reports that you've maybe done in your research, or examined in your research, I should say, then I'd definitely love to hear them.
Okay. Well, these are taken. I'm going to give you a couple from the appendix of my book, The Legitimacy of Miracle.
Okay.
And there are some more, some others in the dialogues, the more popular book, Dialogues on Miracle. So this is an account from a woman in our church. I did not see this miracle myself, but many people in my church witnessed it. And the following account is written on the basis of an interview I conducted with her.
Okay.
So her name is Irene McDonald, and I conducted this interview October 4th, 27. And she's granted me permission to publish the account and talk about it. So I'll just read it to you.
Sure.
Irene McDonald of Fredericton, New Brunswick, a young wife and mother, began in her early 20s to suffer severe back pain and spells of weakness. She had numerous exploratory surgeries by doctors seeking to find the cause of her condition and had a disc removed from her back on the basis of their advice. None of these procedures seemed to help much, but in her late 20s and early 30s, her ailment largely went into remission, and she was able to function comparatively normally. By her mid-30s, however, the earlier symptoms recurred with much greater severity. She was sent by her local doctors in Fredericton and St. John to a specialist in Montreal, where after a series of tests, she was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. She remained in the hospital several months before being discharged and allowed to go home. After a short time at home, her condition further deteriorated, and she was sent back to Montreal. Weakened to the point where it was often impossible for her to turn over in bed, she underwent further examination by numerous doctors. She was subsequently told by the specialist treating her that her MS would progress very quickly, to the point where she would take pneumonia and die. Upon release from the hospital, she came home to Fredericton. At first, she was sometimes able to walk a very little in the mornings, being confined to a wheelchair the rest of the day. Soon, however, her condition worsened to the point where she was bedridden. Eventually, she had to sleep on the floor, with her husband having to turn her every hour because of her muscle spasms and her inability to turn herself. She was at this time receiving spinal injections every 10 days in order to cope with the pain. Irene remembers that when she was first told by the doctor that she had only a short time to live, the fact that she was going to die soon did not really sink in. After several months at home with her condition steadily worsening, the closeness of her death became a reality. Although she believed in divine healing and been prayed for numerous times, she began to sense that death was near. Irene had been urged by her doctors to go into the hospital so that her final days could be easier, but she stayed at home with her husband, Norm, and friends and neighbors providing care. One early Friday afternoon, a friend phoned to tell Irene that she felt God had told her that Irene was going to be healed shortly. Irene thanked her, but told her friend that she was not sure that she would be healed. That afternoon, however, Irene recounts feeling that she met God in a special way. She had been very concerned about what would happen to her daughter in the event of her death, but in prayer felt reassured that God would look after her daughter. Irene further prayed that by morning God would either have left her in her weakened state, in which case she would enter the hospital, or that he would give her a little strength, in which case she would take her increased strength as a sign that she could trust her friend's message that God intended to heal her. At the time, she told nobody of this prayer. That night, Irene had a dream in which she experienced herself as walking. She felt instructed to pray and wait, and that God was going to heal her. When she awoke in the morning, she felt marginally stronger and took this as confirmation of her prayer the day before. She told Norm that she felt that she was going to be healed and that she should go to church the next day. She spent Saturday confined to her bed and praying. Norm phoned their minister and indicated that Irene, who had not been able to go to church for a number of months, hoped to attend the next day. The next day, Irene's daughter came down with a bad case of the flu. Irene, feeling that she needed to go to church, phoned a neighbor who at the last moment canceled her plans to attend church in order to look after Irene's daughter. Irene and Norm got to the church partway through the service. Irene was too weak to walk and had to sit in a chair and be carried into the service. She remembers feeling embarrassed that people in the church would see her in such a weakened and frail state. As she was being carried up the aisle to be prayed for by the minister, she very vividly experienced an inner voice saying, "You will know my power in a minute of time." When the minister, who had no previous experience of having healed someone through prayer, laid hands on her and prayed, she immediately regained feeling in her arms and legs, along with complete control of her body and fully regained muscular strength. Many people are audibly praying, but only one voice stood out in her consciousness, and that was a woman saying, "Just as he made the birds to fly, you will walk out of here." Irene walked out of the church and took up all the activities she'd formerly been too weak to do. In the over 25 years since her healing, there's been no return of any of her symptoms. The experience of the inner voice Irene heard as she's being carried up the aisle is very special to her. She says that she had never experienced God so closely before or after. She stated to me that if she had a choice of being healed 20 years earlier, but without what she experienced going up the aisle, she would choose to wait to be healed in order to experience God's voice as intimately as she did that day.
Wow. Wow. Praise God. That's awesome.
I don't know. I have more, but I don't. Do you want to have another one, or do you want to carry on with the interview?
Well, you've whet my appetite now, Dr. Larmer. So yeah, no, that's awesome. That's amazing. And did she get any kind of, I mean, obviously she's fine now. Did she get any sort of medical kind of confirmation afterwards, you said, or?
I believe she did. I was not able to track it down in the paper. Like it, when I was interviewing her, it was like 25 years later.
Yeah.
But she told me that it had been written up. Right. There are numerous people in the church that were aware of her illness and observed the healing.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's powerful enough, whether a doctor said anything or not. I mean, one minute she's in this horrible condition, she hears voices, experiences, and the presence of God and the voice of God, and has such an amazing turnaround just like that so quickly. And so, yeah, that's obviously should raise an eyebrow for anybody who would be skeptical at the very least. So yeah, no, like I said, you've whet my appetite. So if you want to share one more, I'm definitely all ears.
Okay, I will share one more. And this is a miracle that happened to my pastor's father.
Okay.
And the interview was done on October 19th, 27, with Ruth Drost, the widow of Bill Drost. And also I had conversations with Werner, his son, and also the description of Bill Drost's healing in the book, Bill Drost, The Pentecost. Okay, here it is. William Bill Drost had spent many years as a missionary in various South American countries. While in Uruguay, his health began to fail. He was losing weight and having frequent fainting spells. When he consulted a physician in Uruguay, the doctor told him that he was very ill and that he needed to return to Canada as soon as possible for complete rest and further examination by Canadian doctors. The Drost family decided to return to Canada for a time. They flew first to Miami. In the time between arriving in Miami and catching their connecting flight to Canada, Bill, while praying, felt that he heard an inner voice that said, "This furlough is going to be a great time for you, and you shall glorify me such as never before." On return to Canada, the Drost stayed several days in the London area. We have a city in Ontario called London, with the family of Bill's wife, Ruth. Bill ignored the Uruguay physician's advice and neither rested nor sought medical advice. Instead, he and his family entered into a heavy schedule of church meetings throughout southern Ontario. It soon became evident that Bill's health was continuing to deteriorate. By this time, he'd lost 35 pounds and was continuing to lose weight. He was eventually persuaded to see a physician who, realizing the seriousness of Bill's condition, immediately referred him to a specialist in Montreal. The specialist proved to be a friend from Bill's childhood in Midlands, New Brunswick. He informed Bill that Bill had stomach cancer and recommended an immediate operation. Bill, however, resolved to go home to New Brunswick before taking further action. In New Brunswick, Bill was examined by Dr. Everett Chalmers, who recommended an immediate operation and informed him that even if the operation were successful, Bill would need a tube in his side the rest of his life and would not be able to return to the mission field. Bill very much wanted to attend a religious conference being held in Plaster Rock, New Brunswick, and against the advice of Dr. Chalmers, deferred scheduling the operation until the day after the conference. Bill grew steadily weaker. He suffered bleeding spells, anal leakage, and his bowel movements were so painful that he sometimes fainted. While at Plaster Rock, he had a particularly bad bleeding episode and collapsed. Bill had been prayed for many times regarding the cancer with no results. So when Ruth and others gathered to pray for him, he acquiesced, but with no hope that he would experience healing. During the time of prayer, Bill noticed nothing. As people left after praying, Bill fell asleep. In the morning, he awoke and realized he'd slept the night through without pain. For the first time in months, he was hungry. After eating a substantial breakfast, he had his first normal bowel movement in months. Bill felt that he'd been healed, but kept his appointment on the day he was scheduled to be operated on. When the doctors examined him, they could find no trace of cancer. They kept him in the hospital for 9 days of examinations and tests, finally releasing him with a clean bill of health. Bill experienced no recurrence of the cancer for the rest of his life, dying many years later of an unrelated health problem.
Wow, praise God. That's awesome. So I think that really takes it kind of out of the abstract realm and can just really bring it home for a lot of people. And yeah, it's stories like that, I think, that just can be like really powerful and inspiring to a lot of people. I've experienced things similar to this. Like I felt like I had the voice of God speak to me about an oncoming car that I couldn't see. And it just said, switch lanes. And I switched lanes. And I was able to avoid like a terrible car accident. In the examples that you gave, a lot of times these people, they heard like kind of like an inner voice. They had sort of like a mix between a religious experience and a miracle kind of happening all together. Mm-hmm. And I guess where I'm going with this is when I shared this experience online, I was met with a lot of Christians who were like, wow, that's awesome. That's amazing. But I also had some skeptics. They were almost like angry with me, saying that it was unfair for God to do something like that. You know, what about the other people who ended up hitting the car that I avoided? Or what about the people that do get healed? And then there's all these other people that God doesn't heal. And so it's like they're like these stories imply that some of these people, to them at least, are like, you're saying you're God's special pet or something like that. And so is it arbitrary or unfair to God for God to do things for others and for some and not others, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, this is one of the hardest questions to answer. And that shouldn't really surprise us. I have no doubt that miracles occur. I struggle with the fact of why aren't there more of them? But I would say this. This is a version of the problem of evil, which, you know, I mentioned earlier was one of the biggies against theism. And I think it helps to understand it as a version of the problem of evil. If you think about it, we could equally ask, why aren't all people equally intelligent? Why are some people more intelligent than others? Why are some people better athletes than others? These are all goods. Why doesn't God give everyone all these great goods? Why couldn't I be a basketball player rather than 5'6"?
I same height, so I share your pain.
Yeah. So I don't claim as a theist that I claim I can go some ways towards explaining why God would allow evil, but in the final analysis, evil is a problem. I think, though, a question we should ask is is it any less than a problem for other worldviews? So if you think about atheists, materialists, they have a fairly easy time with what we might call natural evil. That's just the way the universe is. We shouldn't expect it to acquiesce to our desires. But they have a very difficult time. It's very hard if you're a materialist to talk about free will. And if you're going to have moral responsibility, I think you have to have libertarian free will. And there, do we really want to say that people shouldn't be held responsible for what they do? In other words, moral evil is a problem for the materialist.
Right.
And it's not clear, and I've talked about this in greater detail, as I said in my book, but I would argue that other worldviews don't really give as good a reply to the problem of evil. In fact, they tend to explain away evil. In some forms of monistic Hinduism, evil is thought of as an illusion. Right. Well, you know, even if I say the pain is just in my head, it's still a pain. Right. An illusion is itself an evil. Mm-hmm. I've mentioned that for materialists, they have a very hard time with moral evil. So unless these other worldviews give a better response to the problem of evil, I don't think we should take evil as somehow disproving theism. Right. In fact, to the degree that other worldviews tend to explain away evil, evil actually becomes an argument for God, because it's on the basis of a Christian worldview that we talk of evil. Hmm. The materialist says, well, you know, that's just the way the universe is. If you shake your hand at it, so what? For the theist, there is someone to hold accountable. We can question God. We may not understand, but we have an intuition that people ought to behave in different ways and can behave in different ways, but don't. Hmm. I don't know, I've kind of wandered around in my answer there, but as I say, unless you have some kind of better understanding, or an understanding that can accommodate our deepest intuitions, it's not clear that we should dismiss theism on the basis that we can't give a complete answer to the problem of evil.
Right. And if you hear testimonies like these, or you look at, like, say, the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, it would be kind of odd to just discount all of that and throw that away just because there is this existence of evil, and maybe things don't always happen exactly right for everybody else. And it also seems to me like if miracles were to stand out as a sign, unless there is an ordinary course of nature where dead people stay dead or sick people get sick and die, when somebody does get healed of something like we described there, multiple sclerosis or what have you, stomach cancer, none of those things would actually stand out as a sign, so to speak, in a way too. And so I guess Hume, it seemed like, was always trying to pit the laws of nature probabilistically as something like we observe. There's way more evidence for that than there is for these miracle reports, and people are often mistaken or they're lying and different things like that. But it seems to me like, again, none of these things would stand out as a sign unless they were against that backdrop. Does that make sense?
Yes, miracles presuppose a known order. Mm-hmm. Now here we come back to, you asked earlier about definition. The importance of the fact that miracles don't have to violate the laws of nature. Hume's argument is to say, well, any evidence we have for the laws of nature is evidence against a miracle. And of course, we have an enormous amount of evidence for the laws of nature. But if miracles can occur without violating those laws, you can't say that the evidence for the laws of nature is somehow evidence against miracles. That simply won't go. You know, the evidence for the law of gravity is not evidence against my being able to move a stone away from the Earth's surface.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. One more question related kind of to the problem of evil, and you address this in your book. It seems like miracle claims, some will say that God is sort of like a cosmic bumbler of sorts, you know, and so if God is necessarily perfect, then we would expect maybe him to create a perfect world. And we know that he could, because as Christians, we're committed to a belief in an afterlife and a perfect world in heaven. And so if God finds it necessary to intervene, that seems to show that he's like fixing a problem that he himself is somewhat directly or indirectly responsible for. And so do miracles show that God is less than perfect?
Yeah, this is a common objection. Curiously enough, a lot of theologians have raised it, theologians who don't like miracle claims. Couple of points here. One, the idea behind this almost seems to be that, well, if God's going to create, he would create a maintenance-free machine. The better the machine, the less maintenance involved. Well, should we think of creation along the lines of a maintenance-free machine? If we think of, say, a musical instrument, when somebody makes a musical instrument, they make it precisely to be intervened upon, to be interacted with. So the idea that, you know, God would just create and then hands off, I think we're trapped there by kind of a metaphor of this idea of a maintenance-free machine. And especially if we take free will into account, this may bother some of my Calvinist friends, but if we take free will into account, well, God may respond to our choices by intervening. The other thing I think that needs to be said is it's very dangerous to set up a priorize in the sense of God would have to do it this way.
Right.
So, you know, I'll just go to the origin of life question for a moment.
Yeah, sure.
If we think of, suppose you're going to set up an aquarium. I suppose you could set it up, if you're God, so that everything is all front-loaded right from the very beginning. So you just put the aquarium together and then, you know, pour in the water and everything goes the way it should. You eventually get fish, etc., etc.
Right.
Well, is that automatically better than if God creates progressively? Why would we insist that God has to front load everything? Why would we insist that, you know, it's somehow unworthy of God to interact in history?
Yeah.
And just when I'm saying this, I'm also thinking of the problem of evil we talked about a few minutes ago. As a Christian, although I find the incarnation a mystery, I also find it very comforting in that, as regards the problem of evil, if we think of Jesus as God incarnate, God comes down and gets his hands dirty. God suffers on the cross. God knows what it's like to be somebody. You know, at one point Jesus says, you know, foxes have dens. What about the Son of Man?
Right.
So God's involvement in creation seems to me a very hopeful sign and an encouraging sign when we think about the problem of evil. The fact that God sometimes does miracles, we may not know why he doesn't do more, but it shows that he's involved, that he cares. And I think there's less evil in the world if God does miracles than if he didn't.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think it's interesting, we see so often in the Gospels and even a bit in Acts, Jesus a lot of times turned to people and said, you know, according to your faith, be made whole. And I'm not saying that could raise all kinds of theological problems for maybe some people. But you were right when you mentioned free will. A lot of times people had to do something and respond to what they heard about Jesus and come towards him. And even that example of the testimony you gave of the woman with multiple sclerosis, she heard a voice say, you know, like, go to church. She had to respond and act on what she heard and all of that. So there's a lot, maybe he would like to do more miracles if we just were responding to him more. So
I think that's something important to say. I also think it's important to say that it isn't just a matter of believing hard enough,
right? Sure.
That you are going to get a miracle. There are people who we would say are worthy of a miracle and that don't get a miracle, and we can't, in many instances, say why one person gets a miracle but not another. I would say that the principle that Jesus often talks about is, to whom much is given, much is required. Mm-hmm. So it's not automatically the case that people who get miracles just have a suffering-free life. Paul got some miracles, but you know, he was left for dead different times by mobs. So I think often the effect of a miracle is to make people more compassionate, and to, if they respond in the proper way, they become instruments of God's mercy in themselves.
Mm-hmm. That's really good. So, well, awesome. One other question here. We could probably let you go here soon, but one of the biggest objections that I hear, and Hume certainly brought this out in his second part of his essay, was that there's miracle claims and all kinds of other different religions. And you hear like atheists like Sam Harris bring up like Satya Sai Baba and other religious leaders. And so what exactly should we think about these claims as Christians? And this is kind of somewhat related, but somewhat of a separate question. Is there any kind of criteria that we can use to maybe filter out unpromising claims versus more evidentially compelling type of miracle claims?
Yeah. Well, first off, there's no reason why God might not perform a miracle in another religion. When we think of miracles in the New Testament, many times they weren't so much, many of them weren't directed at proving doctrine. They were directed at human need. Mm-hmm. So if you think of Jesus feeding the 5,000, he didn't say, okay, all you guys that accept that I'm the Messiah, you get to be fed. Mm-hmm. He said, this crowd, you know, they've been away. They didn't have any place to buy food. They're going to faint on the way home from hunger. Feed them. So the miracle was in response to human need. Mm-hmm. Now, indirectly, it evidences God and evidences Jesus. But I don't have a problem with thinking that somebody in another religion who prays, say, for her daughter to be healed, that God might perform a miracle. So that's one thing to say. The other thing is the critic is not entitled to say that all reports of miracles are equally plausible or implausible. Much of my work has been to remove the idea that you can make a decision about miracles while sitting in your armchair. Mm-hmm. I try to clear away the philosophical jungle and say, look, if you want to know whether a miracle occurred, that's going to be a matter of historical investigation. Mm-hmm. And at that point, then yes, there are miracle claims that nobody should believe. There are miracle claims that I think everybody should believe. So it won't do simply for the critic to say, okay, well, we have these other miracle claims and they're just as good as the Christian miracle claims. That will be a matter to be investigated. So, for example, I think there are accounts of Buddha having some kind of miraculous birth. How long between the time of Buddha and the arising of those accounts has taken place? So, you know, if we had no accounts of, say, the virgin birth of Jesus till 400 years after Jesus's birth, I would be pretty skeptical. If we have an account of Buddha somehow miraculous birth and it's 400 years after Buddha was alive, I don't take that account nearly as seriously as I would take the gospel accounts. So we have criteria by which we assess testimony, and those will be the routine criteria by which we assess other things.
Right.
Is it multiple witnessed? Is the person who is reporting it of good character? J. Warner Wallace, I believe, Cold Case Christianity, has been making some of these arguments. How do we go about assessing testimony?
Right, exactly. And I mean, if something like, say, Apollonius of Tyana, I mean, so many of his miracles were reported over 100 years later. They were from a great distance away, and nobody can go really examine those. Whereas you compare something like the resurrection of Jesus, where, you know, this went against so much of the early Jewish belief, and the disciples themselves were skeptical. Paul was persecuting the Christians. James was certainly skeptical of his brother. And so there was probably, at least we have good reasons to think, there was some critical examination that happened. And so I think those kind of criteria are at least helpful to get us started in that direction.
Yeah. And I think when you're evaluating it, you have to get into the nitty-gritty. You have to actually say, well, what would it look like if our alternative, what is our alternative hypothesis? If our alternative hypothesis is hallucination, let's see how that matches up.
Right.
If our alternative hypothesis is these are con men, let's see how that matches up. So the skeptic is under some obligation to explain why he or she would take all reports on an equal evidential basis. And I don't think once we actually start to look at this, that they have much chance of saying that all reports are equally, are on the same evidential basis.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned criteria. Of course, miracles, if we're claiming an event as a miracle, we have some idea of what we take God to be, and the event would have to fit with that. Let me give you an example. When I was doing my graduate work, I would go home. I lived on a farm. I'd go home to my parents in the summer. And this one night, there was a big thunderstorm. And I was lying awake listening to it. And I heard my mother in another room say, "Oh, what's that?" And in the morning when I got up, I said, "I heard you in the night say, what's that?" And she said, "Well, you know, during the thunderstorm, a big blue ball of light floated in one window, hovered over my bed, and floated out the other window." Now, that's pretty unusual, but I had no inclination to take it as a miracle. Why? Well, one, we don't know all that much about how lightning operates. When I did some investigation, I found that it was a form of lightning called ball lightning. Two, it doesn't really, I find it very hard to think what God's purpose would be in having a ball of lightning just float around the room and then float out again. So there are criteria. one of them being that we have to somehow be able to fit it in with what we think is God's character. Jesus also says something here. He says, well, whether or not something is to be trusted is to be determined by its fruits. Mm-hmm. And in that same context, and I don't want to see demons or behind every bush or anything like that, but Jesus does talk of false miracles in the sense of works of power, but brought about by agents who are acting against God's purposes.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, because sometimes I'll hear skeptics give like ridiculous parodies, like, you know, well, my uncle flew over the Grand Canyon and that's a miracle. And they'll multiply all these explanations, you know, like, well, and everybody saw it, and this, you know, they were willing to die for their testimony and all this other stuff. And I'm like, well, what exactly does your uncle flying over the Grand Canyon signify? It signifies absolutely nothing. Where Jesus turning water into wine, or feeding 5,000, or raising from the dead has some sort of, it confirms some striking teachings that he came to give us, which obviously would be very important teachings, you know, how to have eternal life, and how we are to live our lives. And, you know, some things just are frivolous and silly and just kind of pointless. And so,
yeah, when somebody reports seeing Jesus walking around Miami, I don't have to take it very seriously.
Right.
And when somebody says, well, I saw Jesus's face on a Pringle potato chip, I'm sorry, I'm skeptical. Before we go, I did want to mention one objection that you haven't mentioned.
Yeah, go ahead.
And that's, I remember some while back in our talk, I said we need to distinguish two questions. Did the event occur, and what's its explanation? Now, sometimes skeptics will take the tack, well, suppose we accept that the event occurred, shouldn't we just say that someday we'll have a natural explanation of it?
Yeah.
In other words, issuing a promissory note.
Yep.
Well, I want to make a couple of comments here. One, it is a promissory note. It's not really an alternative explanation. It's saying we think we'll get one. Mm-hmm. And how good is that promissory note? Well, it depends. The idea is, well, we have a lot of inductive evidence for science being successful and progressively explaining the world. Well, that's true up to a point. But for the events that are typically claimed as miracles in the New Testament, the progress of science, if these events really occurred, and that's a separate question from how we explain them.
Right.
If these events really occurred, the progress of science has made it harder to give them a natural explanation than to see them as miracle. So, for example, supposing Jesus really did turn water into wine. Well, we know a whole lot more about the chemistry of wine than we did 2,000 years ago. That increased knowledge we have only makes it harder to explain how Jesus could have done that.
Right, exactly.
If the materialist says, well, okay, I agree that Jesus resurrected from the dead, but trust me, there will be a natural explanation. I'm going to say, okay, you go ahead and try and give one. And you explain to me why the more we know, the harder that gets to explain.
Right.
So the progress of science, far from ruling out miracles, actually speaks in their favor.
Yeah. It just seems like the more we know about science, the more we know dead people stay dead. And I've actually had a skeptic bring that up to me. They're like, well, even if Jesus did raise from the dead, one day it can be explained naturalistically. And I'm just like, that is a very stubborn faith of the naturalists there. It just seems like the more we know, like I said, about science, the more we know dead people stay dead. You're kind of fighting science at this point, Guy, you know, versus being on its side. And so, yeah, no, that's a very good point. And thanks for catching that. I definitely meant to ask you that question. And so, well, this has been really awesome, Dr. Larmer. I really appreciate you taking an hour of your time to spend with us and talk about miracles. Again, there will be a couple books I'll link in the description: The Legitimacy of Miracle, and Dialogues on Miracle, which is you can get on Kindle for just $10. It's definitely a fun read. And then you said you're working on another book. When can we expect to see that?
I'm on sabbatical this year. I hope to finish it this year. I'm I think there'll be 7 or 8 chapters, and I'm just working on chapter 6 now. So I'm hoping that will be. There's also 2 earlier books of mine on miracle. One called Water into Wine, ? That was actually my MA thesis that turned into a book. And then there's a book called Questions of Miracle, where it is a collection of articles where there's a dialogue between myself and critics. So I will have written an article, a critic will respond to it, I'll respond, or a critic may have written an article and I respond to it. So those are probably available in university libraries if people want to go and have a look at them. Absolutely.
Well, I definitely recommend your work, Dr. Larmer. And again, thanks so much for coming on the program. And yeah, it's definitely been an honor.